One of the most frustrating things about having ADHD is that sometimes I function really well. Like I'm focused, productive, I'm locked in. I have the kind of day where I generally think, okay, maybe I finally figured this out. And then the next day, I can stare at a simple email for 2 hours without touching it. And honestly, I think that's what makes ADHD so confusing. Because over time, I started realizing I wasn't failing in the same way every time. Sometimes I couldn't start. Sometimes I couldn't stay focused. Sometimes I could do both, but couldn't sustain it consistently. And other times, the hardest part was recovering after things started to fall apart. And once I started noticing those patterns, a lot of things about ADHD suddenly made more sense. Not just professionally, but personally too. Because I stopped asking, why can't I get my life together? And started asking, where exactly is my brain breaking down right now? And honestly, that turned out to be a much more useful question. And who am I to be sharing my own ADHD story? My name is Dr. Sulman Aziz Mirza, triple board certified in adult psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and addiction medicine. And this is how I learned how to get shit done. For a long time, I genuinely thought these struggles were a motivation problem or a discipline problem. Because when you're smart enough to compensate sometimes, it becomes really easy to believe that you should just be able to do better. Honestly, I got very good at compensating. Even though I had failed out of dental school, I was able to get a second chance with medical school. Then my top choice of residency. Then my top choice of fellowship. And finally, my top choice job as an attending psychiatrist. From the outside, it probably looked like I had figured things out. But underneath all of that, the same patterns kept showing up. Overcommitting, saying yes to everything, waiting until the pressure became unbearable before finally acting. Constantly feeling like I was surviving my life instead of managing it. And one of the moments that really forced me to confront this was failing my child and adolescent psychiatry board exam the first time I took them. Not because I wasn't capable of passing, I just barely studied. I kept thinking to myself, I'll do it later. And then suddenly, later was the morning of the exam. That moment hit me hard because by that point, I had already accomplished things that supposedly proved I was capable. So, why were these same problems, why I failed out of dental school in the first place, still happening? And that's when I started realizing something important. This wasn't laziness, and it wasn't intelligence either. My brain was breaking down in predictable ways. I just didn't have the language for it yet. And once I saw that pattern, a lot more suddenly started making sense. Not just in myself, but in my patients too. The biggest problem area for me has always been the same, starting. Because one of the hardest parts of ADHD, especially when you're pretty high functioning, is that you usually know what needs to happen. You know the exam matters. You know that email needs a response. You know the task itself probably isn't even that difficult. And somehow your brain still doesn't move. Not because you don't care, not because you're lazy. It's like the connection between knowing and doing just fails and falls apart. And if you've experienced that before, you already know how impossible that is to explain to someone who hasn't. Because from the outside, it looks really simple. But internally, it can feel like pressing the gas pedal while the car stays parked. And once I started noticing that pattern, I realized that ADHD wasn't just one problem. It was usually breaking down in 4 different places: start, stay, sustain, and stabilize. Honestly, most people don't struggle equally with all 4. For some people, like me, the biggest struggle is start. For other people, it's stay. And this is where ADHD starts feeling really contradictory. Because people think ADHD means you can't focus. But a lot of times, it's not an inability to focus. It's difficulty regulating where your focus goes, or how long it stays there. That's why someone with ADHD can spend 6 straight hours hyper-focused on one thing and still struggle to stay engaged with the thing that they actually need to do. And then there's sustain, which honestly, I think is where a lot of high-functioning people with ADHD eventually hit a wall. Because some people can start. Some people can even stay focused really well. But they can't maintain that level of functioning consistently over time. Their life works in bursts. Good days, good weeks, moments where everything suddenly clicks. And then somehow disappears again. And that's followed by exhaustion, inconsistency, burnout, or complete collapse. I think this is one of the biggest reasons that ADHD gets misunderstood. People confuse intensity with consistency, but they are not the same thing. And then finally, stabilize, which in reality might be the most emotionally painful one, because this isn't really about productivity anymore. It's about what happens after things start falling apart. The missed deadline, the avoided text, the ignored email, the growing shame, the feeling that your life is piling up faster than you can recover from it. And over time, a lot of people stop feeling lazy and start feeling broken. So, how did this change things for me? Once I started seeing ADHD through these 4 patterns, start, sustain, and stabilize, a lot of things suddenly became much less confusing. Because instead of asking, why can't I get my life together? I started asking, where exactly is my system breaking right now? And that is a very different question. That shift matters a lot more than people realize. Because when you define the problem incorrectly, you usually end up attacking yourself instead of the actual issue. That's what happens to a lot of people with ADHD. They spend years believing that they are lazy, that they're inconsistent, that they're undisciplined, unmotivated, when in reality their brain is struggling with very specific forms of executive dysfunction that nobody ever taught them how to recognize. From my experience, a lot of people with ADHD spend years trying to fix themselves before realizing that they were never measuring the problem correctly in the first place. And once you start to identify your actual failure points, you can finally stop fighting yourself all the time. Because the goal here is not becoming some perfectly optimized productivity machine. I don't think that's realistic. The goal is understanding yourself well enough that you stop feeling at war with your own brain. That was one of the biggest mindset shifts for me personally. Because once I stopped viewing myself as lazy and started viewing myself as someone struggling with inconsistent regulation, well, a lot of the shame started losing its grip. And obviously, this framework isn't perfect. It's just something that I gradually started piecing together through living with ADHD, studying ADHD, treating ADHD, and repeatedly seeing the same pattern show up in both myself and my patients. But the more I talk about this with people, the more I realize how many of us are walking around feeling broken, when really, we've just never been taught how to understand the way our brain actually functions. I think that understanding changes everything. Because once you can identify where your system breaks, you can finally start building systems around it, instead of constantly blaming yourself for it. So, over the next few videos, I want to break these down individually. Start, stay, sustain, and stabilize. Because each one fails differently, and each one usually needs a different strategy. And if you've spent years wondering, why does my ADHD feel inconsistent? Why do I function so well sometimes and completely fall apart other times? Well, I hope that this framework gives you a starting point for understanding that a little differently. Until next time, be safe and be well.